Dear colleagues, it's my pleasure to present to you very preliminary and very partial results of the project that we undertook with the support of the HSE program for basic research support 2 years ago. Frankly speaking, if I knew at that days all difficulties associated with this project, we probably didn't start. We had a very simple idea in mind to do an analysis of higher education development in 15 post-Soviet countries. The idea was very simple. We have countries that inherited very similar higher education system, very uniform, very carefully planned. What happened in a quarter of a century and why the trajectories of higher education development in these countries were different or similar? We found researchers to dig the data, to find the data, to do some preliminary analysis, very preliminary analysis in all 15 countries. Interestingly, and it's now we understand why, in some countries we didn't find anyone, but we found, for example, the person in Germany is writing about Belarus, the person in US is writing about Turkmenistan, etc., etc. So the total group is about 50 people, and me and Anna Smolentsova and Yuri Yusman from Ghent University are editors, and Dmitry Semenov and Daria Platonova are members of our coordination team. So the design of the study has two stages. In the first stage, we just wanted to understand the core transformations in each country, and then we spent quite a time, and it's an interesting issue to discuss where to focus the study, where to look at exactly. We found that the majority of literature, no surprise, looked at the role of international organizations in higher education development. The international organizations like World Bank or UN or UNESCO, which is part here, they finance these studies. And there was no bias, they just financed what they were interested in. There were also a lot of studies on students' mobility and privatization. We found that if you want to look at the core of the transformation, we have to look at the institutional landscape, the structure and the nature of the institutions, organizations, if you like, in this regard, within the system. So the beauty of this study for us, and we appreciate it, in fact, despite all difficulties, is that we have fresh transformation experience. In fact, many people, almost half of our team has an experience, not many, 1/3, okay, has an experience to study in Soviet Union. So they can see this transformation through their personal lens, not just from the objective data. Also, we found that it's a surprising deficit of comparative studies among these 15 countries. There are some studies in the so-called stance Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan, no Turkmenistan data. Some studies about, a lot of studies about Russia, no comparative studies, some studies about Baltic states, but surprisingly lack of comparative studies. And again, as I mentioned, the focus of most of the existing studies, talking we about one country study or comparative study, are privatization, some studies on academic professions, a lot of studies on internationalization in light of Bologna process, policy borrowing, mobility. We want to focus on the driving forces and the system strategy. I have to also say a few words how we see the Soviet system and what we study in terms of the past dependence, when we want to look at the past dependence. And the Soviet system was very peculiar, using the word that Yaroslav Kuzminov, Dmitry Semenov, and I first used in our paper on the evolution of Soviet system. We have quasi-corporate system, which served only the economy. The main and the only function of this system was a manpower supply. It was well-designed machine. You can read it in our papers, and the market was completely absent. It could exist because of the restricted access, mandatory placement. In fact, mandatory placement was probably the bone of this, the most important bone of the skeleton of this system. And state-regulated curriculum and high degree, in fact, unprecedented high degree of the state control. The institutional landscape of this system was also well thought and well designed. In fact, this design of the system survived for 50 years because we found that the main features of this system were really in place in 1939. And it had very specialized universities that served particular industries and even enterprises, very specific type, we call them classical universities. In fact, there was no such term in the official documents in Soviet Union. These are, we could call them traditional universities with basic science and humanities, and they had their own function in the system. Each element of this, again, well-thought system had its own function. In fact, the whole idea about this system was high specialization of the organizations. In fact, this is the reason why in 30s research institutions were separated from the university. So, in fact, today, when we collected this enormous amount of data, stories, anecdotes about quarter of century development in 15 countries, we could pose a lot of interesting questions. And we invite researchers to join our team. You can look at academic profession and into access and inequality, into power relations. Extremely interesting question about language policies, place of ethnic and religious renaissance in the higher education development. Students' experience is an extremely interesting question. Today in the presentation, I would focus on the question of the state policies. Because in fact, what we learned from our study tells us that the higher education, the theory of higher education policies is not that is widely used in the literature is really not complete. It doesn't take into account the realities of the last quarter of the century development in higher education. And this question is, again, what are the differences in the policies and what were the changes? A few graphs for you to look at the differences. This is number of higher education institutions in Soviet times. And you see, again, that starting from end of 30s, the number of institutions didn't change much. It was really, in our understanding, insignificant. And in fact, there were no such things, almost no such things like mergers, etc., etc. So the structure of the system stays almost the same. There are a few exceptions in Kazakhstan, Belarus, and Uzbek Republic. And in Kazakhstan, we know the reason, and we have to learn a bit more about other. But in general, the system was quite stable. What happened after? We see the differences. We see the growing number of higher education institutions in this country. And in some countries like Ukraine, the difference is 4 times. In most of the country is about 3 times. And this is really remarkable picture of a huge system expansion. It's a number of universities. In fact, in almost all countries, there was an opportunity to open private institutions. So this is not public institutions only, but it doesn't make big differences. The institutional landscape changed dramatically. And here we have fantastic data on students' numbers. And obviously we had to weight it and reflect the population changes, decline or growth. And we see that, but still we see the patterns. We see that in majority of countries there was a dramatic growth in students' enrollment, and only in few countries we see the decline, significant decline. Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan, and relatively low enrollment. So the questions now, what happened? What were the policies and why? Okay. And again, in all countries we observed a huge growth of demand in higher education. In fact, Uzbekistan that showed negative, that showed a decline of the enrollment. We see the growth of the demand. And so some countries responded positively to this growing demand and some not. Does it mean that all countries that responded positively to the demand had the same policy? In a sense, yes. Sorry. Again, as I mentioned, the most countries responded to the demand by significant growth of private institutions. And but what is common for all these countries except Turkmenistan, and in fact it's quite unique in higher education financing. For example, China or Vietnam didn't go this way, or Mongolia when they reformed higher education. Post-Soviet countries allowed universities to have 2 streams of students, fee-paying and free, or non-fee, or non-paying. And this made a real difference. Again, I have to, but when you look on the average numbers, it doesn't tell you much. In fact, when you try to dissociate the numbers among different types of universities, you see more interesting and nuanced picture. In fact, in classical work by Barton Clark and later, we got the model of the role of the state, insights on the role of the state in the higher education governance. And all this literature assumes that there is unified higher education policy in the country. And our main conclusion, in fact, that's an example of the typology of such state policies in higher education. Laissez-faire, market competitive, central planning. And again, the idea is that there is unified higher education policy. Our conclusion from our study, there is no unified higher education policy. The only reason for higher education policy in this country is legitimation. The regimes want legitimacy, and all these countries have similar challenges: growing demand, nation-state building, market transition, and therefore, in fact, they develop three different higher education policies. We could call them one, but in fact they are very different. They develop three sectors, and each sector is governed by different policy. Centrally controlled sector, business-oriented sector, and demand absorption sector. The only country, in fact there are two countries that have brutal dictatorships. Sorry, I hope there are no patriots from these countries. Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan, and obviously Turkmenistan is a very radical example, and they don't care about legitimacy. They don't, in fact, they care, but they don't use higher education as one of the sources of their legitimacy. Therefore, they are good examples of state-controlled policy, unified, clear policy. All other countries, in fact, employ these three different policies. And my final points will be just brief examples of each sector. So when we talk about centrally controlled sector, we have global research universities or world-class universities that each country wants to have. And they also, they can have nation symbolic universities with a special law like Tartu University in Estonia, for example, or Higher School of Economics and other universities participating in the global competitiveness program. The paradox of this group is that they have higher autonomy and much higher degree of the government control. Another group is kind of relic of quasi-corporate system. Former specialized universities that still, it's interesting, in all these countries, the former specialized universities, unlike China, were not moved under the Ministry of Education. All medical universities stay under the ministries of the health, and they perform the function of the manpower supply for this particular sector. Yeah, I'm finished. And they also, and the governments try to introduce quasi-market mechanisms without big success, but still there are some. And finally, the demand absorption sector, which is a new sector of, as we call, mass public education. There are a lot of, and the state behaves very interesting. Again, it looks like there is more control. In fact, there is less control. The state intervenes only if something wrong happens. There is a great example of what is this? Yeah, this is an example of Georgia. When Saakashvili came to the power, look at the decline in enrollment. So, in fact, by from till 2004, Georgia had 180 private universities. 180. Saakashvili government closed down more than 100 private universities. You see, that's a unique, by the way, example of the dramatic decline of the enrollment. So, finally, we think that there are a number of driving forces behind these different policy postures. But again, our main conclusion is that these countries, in fact, don't have, we shouldn't speak about unified higher education policy. We should understand that the higher education system becoming very heterogeneous and really requires countries to have more than one higher education policy. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for this presentation. I must say that this is really an impressive project for the challenges it undertakes, and at the same time it is fascinating because it is an exploration into the recent past. The recent past that has not been easy because you are investigating countries that have undergone a deep transformation and then many changes, the movement from planned economy to capitalism, the openness of the educational system to the international competition and various reforms that are indeed challenging for this world, decided for the population they serve. And well, I don't know if I'm more happy not to be in the project than yet it's very, very interesting. At the same time, I must admit that I'm a bit shy to comment on this because, as you probably have understood, I come from Italy. So for me, Soviet Union and then the recent past of Russia is something that has been largely been told through school books, and then I learned something since I come to laboratory. So I'm a bit shy. My main thoughts are the following. The first thing is we have seen that there has been changes, institutional changes in the way higher education institutions are organized in Soviet Union and then in the countries that compose it. Yet, would you be able to say anything about whether it was worth it? Can we associate these changes with any measurable variation in the output of the higher education institution? For instance, has the performance of students changed, improved over time? Or the amount of exchange with other universities? I don't know which kind of measures could be used to see whether these changes indeed were worth it or not. And the other question is, if you could match this kind of information with people's desire towards higher education institutions. I explain myself better. Do these changes mirror population's desire towards higher education institutions? The privatization meant probably more expensive, more exclusive schooling, which not everyone could afford, which might have increased inequalities within the population, and therefore created barriers for some.
Ideal universities for this kind. What kind of model they try to use? Because previously you mentioned that all methodological guidance were coming from Moscow or St. Petersburg, and this was very clear, centralized. Now different countries start going to different dimensions, different directions. What is the guiding principle for them? How they manage to, how this guidance influences the path? I think it could be a very interesting question. Thank you.
Direct reaction?
Yeah. I shall start from the second question. It's an easier one. what is the ideal model, and I can tell you that it's really surprising that these very, very different countries, in fact, again, we exclude Turkmenistan, and shouldn't exclude it, but it really represents the end of continuum, because Turkmenistan is a great example of mad reforms, and the ideal model was in the brain of one person, and he reformed everything according to this model. But other 14 countries, maybe with some exception in Uzbekistan, in fact went to very similar pathway, despite they have completely different political regimes. So I was really surprised to learn how little European policies influence the development of higher education in Baltic states. So again, our conclusion is that there are three major driving forces in all these countries. First was state legitimacy, state global legitimacy, and the need to build a nation state. For example, even small countries like Moldova opened diplomatic academy because they need diplomats, and they cannot train their diplomats in Moscow anymore. All countries open military academies, etc. Then the second driving force was the fast dependence, and the idea to keep the past. So they didn't want to close their. That might be working. Okay. Yes. They didn't want to close down some universities, and the last, even they partially did it. Again, not too much details, and they had a huge demand that they had to satisfy, and they built a sector. They allowed the demand absorption sector to appear. The second question, which is common for both discussants, is where does demand comes from? There is first, dear colleagues, indeed, the individual return for higher education is declining, but is still relatively high. And even the average return is declining. People that enter higher education system, they have hopes that they will get highest return. But in fact, I have a question for your group, because you are dealing with desires and wishes, etc. Because we think, in fact, we had an interesting discussion recently with another international group that studied the so-called high participation systems. The system is participation of more than 50% of the age cohort in higher education. And we have a hypothesis, which is not, in fact, confirmed, that if you have more than 50% of the age cohort at universities, higher education is becoming social norm. It's becoming almost age norm, like risky behavior in adolescence. Also, there are some studies, we need more in post-Soviet countries, that if you have parents, even one parent with higher education, they expect that their kids will have higher education. So then you can imagine the exponential growth. So but to be very frank, there is no economic rationale behind the expansion of the higher education system. At least we don't see it. Immediate economic rationale.
Okay. Katarina.
Thank you very much. It's a very interesting topic also, and something that is important to us all. Actually, I have just maybe two comments. One is, what I was maybe wanted not to see, because you speak about like the transformations, like dynamics, but there is nothing about the different programs, types of programs. I mean, happening within the also post-Soviet countries, like part-time or evening courses or distant courses, so which is a huge transformation. And second point is that actually you've also, well, with your grade analysis, with your grade data, you come up then with a somewhat such a conclusion that, well, in those countries that like it's not in Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, which are not authoritarian, that we have sort of increase in types of universities. Well, on one hand, yes, and maybe you want just something more on that inside would be also more interesting.
Yep, that's in our plans to look at different programs and to see more detailed picture. I get very, I don't want to call our work superficial, but very first cut.
All right. Francesco, then, you have a point.
Thank you. Well, it's just a thought that I had while listening at you, because you asked the question to this group saying, I have an hypothesis that when in a cohort more than 50% of people are enrolled, then education becomes a social norm. What do you think about it? I have a different hypothesis. And my impression is that when in a cohort more than 50% are enrolled, education becomes a positional good. That is to say, a good that is necessary to have in order to step over the others. Therefore, it is relative deprivation that drives the demand for higher educational consumption rather than social desirability or not being excluded. What do you think?
In other words, it's a social comparison hypothesis.
Put it differently.
Yeah.
We don't want to lose profits.
That's, it should be tested. It
Yes.
should be tested. And thank you very much. I will take
Maybe it's actually not mutually exclusive, these two interpretations. I think it can be both at the same time. There is a herding effect, indeed. I mean, I see the point. If more than 50% are doing this, you know, norm pressure can also be reduced. It can be both.
Yeah.
Also,
Edward.
yeah. Also, it seems that university education is luxury. That in some country contexts, for instance, in Uzbekistan, you know, where high birth rates, not present time because they have gone down, but previously high birth rates have resulted in the fact that there are too many people, high unemployment, and the scarce resources. You know, it is understandable that the government wants to keep, you know, this position at a relatively limited number because it is expensive. And I wonder what is the situation in, say, neighboring Kyrgyzstan, which is also a very poor country, but it has a more or less fair policy. It doesn't have such brutal dictatorship, as you put it, as in Uzbekistan or Turkmenistan. So, what is the enrollment? Is it actually increasing? And
Yes.
what do these people do in Kyrgyzstan?
Nobody cares what they do, but again, there is a pressure, there is a demand, and like calling from UNDP said, there were a lot of diploma deals in Kyrgyzstan, but also all public universities open fee-paying programs. So they effectively tried to absorb this demand, and Kyrgyzstan has very high rate of expansion. They, as far as we know, definitely there are huge differences in income between the graduates of different types of universities. And probably we'll see in the nearest future, even in public understanding, the big differences So people would not ask you, are you are you at university? They would ask, at what university you are.
Right.
Yeah. So, but Kyrgyzstan is, again, it doesn't depend. The surprise for us, again, it's that even poor countries have this exponential growth. Thank you very much.